If you were escaping slavery, would you face going back to save others? One woman would, and she did it many times. This video looks at the life of Harriet Tubman, one of the most celebrated heroes in the story of the abolition of slavery. She was born into slavery, but found her way out of it through her own conviction, becoming a rescuer, a general, and an icon. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, known as Minty, around 1820 in Maryland. She was born to enslaved parents, and sadly, like a lot of people born into slavery, the exact details of her birth and family are hazy. Her father was Ben Ross, a skilled woodsman, and her mother was Harriet Green, known as Rit, who was a cook. The only grandparent we know of was her maternal grandmother, known as Modesty, who had come over on a slave ship from Africa. There was suggestion that their family was descended from the Ashanti people, from what is now known as Ghana, but there was no evidence for this. They resided on a large plantation in the Madison area of Dorchester County, owned by Mary Broadess and her husband, Anthony Thompson. Her parents, like most enslaved parents, would have done their best to recreate a stable family environment despite their situation. Harriet recalled only 2 memories as a very young child, being the centre of attention when young white women came up from the big house, and the cradle her own father had made for her from a gum tree. Harriet Tubman wasn't an only child, and she had 8 siblings altogether, but many of them did not get to grow up together. Enslaved families were often broken apart either by relatives and children being sold away to other slave owners or being sent to work on other farms. 3 of her sisters, Lina, Maria Ritty and Soph, were sold by the son of Mary Broadess, Edward. Harriet and her family never saw them again. They almost lost her brother Moses when Edward was approached by a slave trader from Georgia about taking the boy. But her mother Rit was not prepared to lose another of her children. Aided by other enslaved people and free blacks, she hid him for a month without detection. But eventually she had to face both the Georgia man and Edward Broadess as they came to the slave quarters to take Moses by force. But Rit faced them and would not let them pass, telling them, "You are after my son, but the first man that comes into my house, I will split his head open." The 2 men backed away and the sale was abandoned. No doubt this story and the grief and fury at her sisters being gone helped stir a belief in Harriet about resisting against the slavery that held her family. This was the way in which Harriet would have learned of the world she lived in, that some were free and some were bonded. What must it have been like as a young child to know that her life and those of her family were not their own? Her everyday life must have been hard and terrifying. She would have seen little of her mother, who was kept working at the house for the Broadess family, and it would have fallen to Harriet to help look after her younger siblings. When Harriet was just 5 years old, Mary Broadess hired her out to be a nursemaid for a woman known as Miss Susan. She was run ragged with domestic tasks, but her main job was to rock the cradle of Miss Susan's baby, look after it and feed it, and when the baby woke up and cried, she was whipped. There can be no doubt of the brutality of whipping a small girl, and Harriet wore the scars of this for the rest of her life on her neck. Her work would have been back-breaking for a young adult and was horrific for a child. As a result, she grew ill and soon became worthless to her new employer, being sent back to her mother to be nursed better. Another employer made her wade out into waist-high water to collect muskrats while she had the measles. Instead of being cared for as a young child should be, she was made to continue working until she collapsed, again sent back to her mother. But these experiences didn't break her. She would fight back, wearing extra clothes so as not to feel the regular beatings. She also would run away for a few days. No doubt this likely got Harriet into trouble, but it seems there was a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished. but it's a sad picture of a little girl whose life was defined by the hard labour she was put through. Did she ever have any free time? Did she have a toy of any kind? Was she confident and extroverted, or quiet and reticent? Harriet herself offered up no answers to these questions, but guesses can be made. In a world where she knew the punishment for refusing to do her work or escaping from it could be severe, she fought back anyway. Harriet was tenacious and unafraid when she knew her cause was just. She was also brave. As she grew older and stronger, her duties changed. She would have been put to hard labour in the fields, hauling logs and ploughing. There would have been no rest, no breaks. From sunrise until sunset, Harriet and her family would have worked without stopping, and any resistance would have been met with severe punishment. However, she preferred it, if it can be described as such, to domestic work alongside the white slave owners. Outside it was hard labour, but she could work alongside her brothers and friends, and was out in the fresh air and seasonal changes. Harriet once suffered a severe injury to her head, caused when an overseer threw a heavy metal weight at another slave attempting to escape, but hit her instead. The escaping man was her friend, who had made his way to a small store, and Harriet stood in the doorway to prevent the overseer passing through. The overseer received no punishment for any of his part in this. Tubman would later say that it broke her skull, but she received no proper treatment for her wound. She was dumped back at the Brodesses' farm on the seat of a loom and left for 2 days with no medical aid. This would leave her with lifelong seizures and headaches, and times where she would seemingly fall unconscious but still be aware of what was happening around her. There is some suggestion that her condition may have been temporal lobe epilepsy, which also had another side effect. As a result of the condition her injury had given her, Harriet began to experience very vivid dreams and auditory and visual hallucinations, which she said she experienced as visions from God. No doubt this had a great impact on Harriet's character, and her faith grew as she also attended Methodist church with her family. However, she vehemently disagreed with the teachings of the white ministers, who preached that enslaved people should be passive and obey those who had enslaved them. The Old Testament stories of revenge had a greater impact on how she viewed her situation. Her religious conviction would never leave her and would impact many events throughout her life. It is not surprising that Harriet and other enslaved people held so tightly to their faith in a world that forced people to bleed for others, to be sold from their families, and to see no end to this. As an adult, her father was freed as part of a stipulation in the will of Anthony Thompson once he reached the age of 45. Her mother was supposed to have had the same, but Mary Brodess and her son chose to ignore this. As an enslaved mother's status was passed on to her children, it also meant for Harriet she would seemingly never be free. Despite this, in 1844 she married John Tubman. He was a free black man who worked odd jobs, but would still have faced severe racism and prejudice despite his status. Marriages between someone enslaved and someone free were common in Maryland at this time, where at least half the black population were no longer slaves. There isn't much to read into this, as they still would have been second-class citizens, not paid well and not treated well. If anything, it simply hints at the slave owners in this area struggling financially to keep on slaves when they had to feed them and house them, however poorly. It's possible John and Harriet had planned to buy her freedom eventually. In 1849, Harriet became ill, and Edward Brodess attempted to sell her. This triggered Harriet's anger, although it's likely she didn't need much of a push. She turned to her faith, praying each night for God to change the ways of Brodess, who she commented in later life was not a godly man. But when it looked as though he had found a buyer, and there were rumours he would sell a few of her brothers as well, Harriet changed her prayers. Filled with fury at her enslaver, and no doubt memories of her lost sisters and nearly lost brother resurfacing, her prayer changed to one of vengeance. In her own words, she said, "Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of the way, so he won't do no more mischief." When a short time later Brodess actually died, she expressed regret for her sentiments, but likely more out of a moral fear for herself than any grief for his demise. This also made it almost certain that his widow would sell most of the slaves to make up for the loss of her husband's income in managing his estate. Harriet refused to allow any more of her future to be in someone else's hands. Despite John's attempts to dissuade her, she made the decision to escape. As she put it, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." On the 17th of September 1849, Harriet and two of her brothers Ben and Harry made their escape. Not long after they returned, but Harriet was determined to continue on, even alone. But this was all the more amazing because she was a young woman in her 20s, not a man. The journey must have been terrifying. There were slave catchers, notorious gangs who captured runaway slaves, and unfamiliar terrain. Most slaves rubbed a herb, asafoetida, on their feet and legs to help hide their scent from any dogs sent to track them, and perhaps Harriet knew this trick. She mostly travelled in the darkness of night, using the North Star as a guide to the border, and during the daytime she was helped by friends of the newly created Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network of those who wanted to help enslaved people, usually Quaker members known as conductors, and they would help those escaping by hiding them during the day and providing directions to the next stop. Call signs such as owl hoots and passcodes were used along the 90-mile journey, which could have taken Harriet anywhere between 10 days and 3 weeks. However, the exact details of Harriet's journey are unknown. In her lifetime, she had to keep quiet about the routes and the people who helped along them in order to maintain safety for those still crossing. But we do know that at last she made it across to Philadelphia and freedom. Years later, she stated her joy at passing over the border. "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." But her joy was soon to be marred by grief and fear of those she had left behind, her family. If she was free, it was only right that they should be free too. But it wasn't so simple. Aware of the lure of the northern states' promise of freedom and an unfettered life, aided by many people who believed in the abolition of slavery, fugitive slaves became a thorny issue for the government. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, building on an earlier act from 1793, allowing fines and prison time for anyone found abetting a runaway from slavery. The act stated that someone bonded in service in another state would not be free of it by reaching a different state, but should be returned, and forced law officials, even if they didn't want to aid in this. Any enslaved person without a white escort needed to have a pass written by their owner, part of the reason that illiteracy was so widespread amongst slaves. If they learned to read and write, they could forge their own passes. No pass would mean severe and unspeakable punishments. Once Harriet reached the free black community of Philadelphia, it would have been a wonderful sight. Black shopkeepers, milliners and tailors, sailors, food sellers and barbers, all living their own lives and enjoying the fruits of their labour themselves. Many of these people, most of whom had escaped themselves, then gave back by also aiding those fleeing slavery. Some created ingenious ways to hide people in order to sneak them further north without being detected. One clever black funeral director would put on fake funeral processions with one or more fugitive slaves hidden in coffins and taken far out of the city to safety. Many tried to make their way to southern Ontario, then part of the United Province of Canada, which as part of the then British Empire had abolished slavery outright. But Harriet remained in Philadelphia, doing odd jobs and working hard to save money to help her family. It wasn't long before Harriet would set out on the first of what would become many trips back into slave territory. In December 1850, she got word that her niece Keziah and her 2 children, 6-year-old James Alfred and baby Araminta, were soon going to be sold. Although it's unlikely that any message sent from home would ask her to put herself in personal danger, Harriet decided to go herself into Maryland once more. Using help from the Underground Railroad, she made her way to Baltimore. There, she would later meet with Keziah's husband, a free black man named John Bowley. In Cambridge, while they were waiting to be put on the auction block, the auctioneer left for his lunch. They took their opportunity and made a run to a nearby safe house. From there, they sailed on a log canoe by night to Baltimore, to Bodkin's Point on the Chesapeake's western shore, where they met with Harriet, who brought them through a safe route to Philadelphia. Despite the dangers she faced going back towards the slave states, Harriet, showing her fierce, stubborn determination and her extraordinary will, had freed more of her family, and they wouldn't be the last. It's likely Harriet was aided in her trips by Thomas Garrett, an abolitionist and Quaker who was central to the running of the Underground Railroad, living and working from Delaware, and William Still, a free black man who was his closest comrade, scarred by slavery through his mother's fugitive status and the loss of 2 of his brothers into slavery further south. In the spring of 1851, Harriet made a second daring journey into Maryland, this time rescuing one of her brothers and 2 of his co-workers, bringing them safely into the freedom of Philadelphia. And in the autumn of the same year, having saved up her money for a man's suit for him, Harriet made a 3rd trip to Dorchester County, with the intention of convincing her husband to come back with her. However, this deeply personal mission would not go to plan. She managed to make her way undetected to somewhere near Cambridge, and sent word to John Tubman he should meet and leave with her to Philadelphia. But while she was in hiding, she got word back that her husband refused to see her, and that he was married again to a woman named Caroline. It must have been heartbreaking. In their separation of just less than 2 years, Harriet had always considered them married and must have imagined that John missed her as much as she missed him. But instead, she had been replaced. At first, she later said, she wanted to burst into their house and create a scene. But Harriet's unstoppable personality meant she quickly understood that she now had to think about a new life for herself, one in which John wasn't present. Leaving behind John and his new wife, Harriet instead found some of her family members, and for the first time, others who wanted to escape, who were strangers to her. Altogether, there were 11 in this party, including her brother William Henry and his sweetheart Catherine. They planned to get married once they were free, as they had not been given permission to do so. This time, Harriet took them all the way to Canada, no longer trusting to leave anyone in the US with the new laws about runaway slaves. It's possible they even stopped over at the house of Frederick Douglass, a prominent and outspoken abolitionist. Although there is no way to be sure for certain, in his autobiography he stated, "On one occasion I had 11 fugitives at the same time under my roof, and it was necessary for them to remain with me until I could collect sufficient money to get them to Canada. It was highly rare for there to be such a large group of fugitive slaves, for the obvious reason that it was easier to get caught in a large group, and it was the same time of year, which makes it very likely it may have been Harriet's charges." From this point on, she admitted that John Tubman fell out of her heart, and she moved on into a new chapter of her life. Harriet now became an Underground Railroad conductor, and she would become known as the most famous one. Her ability to get so many to safety would earn her the nickname of Moses. Her actions were also brilliant PR for the Underground Railroad, a former and fugitive slave who was willing to risk her life to rescue others from bondage. But for Harriet herself, she didn't see this the same way. She saw her vocation as a calling from God, and she wore her faith as her armour. From 1852, Harriet would regularly make trips into the southern slave states, sometimes more than one. Overall, she would make more than 70 trips and rescue hundreds of enslaved people. And she did this alone. As much as fellow abolitionists cheered her on, and may even have offered their homes in the North as safe houses, it was Harriet herself who took the risk of going into slave territory. She kept no records, but she usually aided those in Virginia and Maryland, and she built up a deep network of contacts in Philadelphia, Wilmington, and New York. Ever careful of when the best time for her journeys was, Harriet would only travel by night, when it was darker for longer and people were less likely to be out. And the funds for these raids came mainly from her own labours as a cook and domestic in the spring, when she would travel out of Canada after winter, useful both for expenses and bribes. But the risks were great, and often Harriet came close to being discovered. Once she donned a disguise of bonnet and 2 chickens, which she pulled on the legs of in order for them to make a noise as a former owner came by, allowing her to look away as though calming the chickens. Another time, travelling by train, she noticed another passenger was someone who had known her, and she grabbed a newspaper to pretend to read it. She was known to be illiterate, and so she was ignored. Once, when transporting 2 men across from the south, they had to cross an unfamiliar field and river. The 2 men refused to go across after no boat or bridge was found, and Harriet had to wade across herself to the other side before they sheepishly followed her. By the 1850s, slaveholders began to suspect a white abolitionist in the northern states was behind the disappearance of their slaves, and they put a large reward on the head of Moses. Although there is some argument over how much it was, it could have been somewhere between $12,000 and $40,000, possibly a combination of many bounties from around the area. This was a huge amount at a time when a small farm could be purchased for $400. Despite this and her close calls, Harriet and her runaways were never discovered. She later told an audience proudly, "I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Sometime in early 1859, Harriet was offered a small piece of land and house by Senator William Seward in his hometown of Auburn, New York, on terms she could afford. Seward was a lawyer who had prospered and married into a prominent family through his wedding to Frances Miller, and was an ardent champion of anti-slavery. The house he now offered Harriet was part of his wife's immense inheritance. Harriet accepted happily, especially as her parents, recently rescued from the harshness of life in the South even for free blacks, were finding the Canadian winters difficult in their old age. But not long after acquiring the Auburn property, a very strange and out-of-place incident occurred in Harriet's life. She made another trip to Maryland, this time returning with a young girl of 8 years old named Margaret. This would have been nothing out of the ordinary for one of Harriet's feats, except that Margaret claimed she had been born a free black, kidnapped from a prosperous and loving home, where she left behind a mother, father and siblings, including a twin brother. Harriet herself claimed the girl was a niece of one of her brothers, but this made no sense if Margaret's story of her father being free was true. But if her story wasn't completely true, and in fact she was not aware that her family weren't free, Why did Harriet only take her and not her parents or siblings? But there were more mysteries surrounding this. Even if both her parents were free, the name Margaret gave for her mother could not be found in any records. The young girl had a single memory of her life in Maryland, that her family had a pair of chestnut horses and a shiny carriage. She also claimed that when she went with her Aunt Harriet on a steamboat, she forgot to weep over her separation from her twin brother, her mother, and the shiny carriage she liked so much. It seems strange that a single steamboat ride would cause little grief over being separated from her entire family. In later years, Margaret's daughter Alice, who was close to her great-aunt Harriet, would state how her actions in Maryland caused great distress, suggesting whatever happened was not done with the knowledge of Margaret's family. Alice also suggested her mother had been kidnapped, stating that Harriet saw the child she herself might have been if slavery had been less cruel. She added that Harriet knew the joys of motherhood would never be hers, and she longed for some little creature who would love her for her own self's sake. But this still isn't enough to explain why Harriet, so acutely aware of the pain caused by ripping siblings and families apart, would kidnap a young girl from a safe, loving home. After adopting Margaret, Harriet then placed her with the Seward family until she was settled after the Civil War in Auburn and could look after Margaret herself. But there were still other strange elements, such as how Margaret was described by family members as being very similar in looks and personality to Harriet, perhaps suggesting a closer relationship than aunt and niece. And for all of the girl's stories about her well-off free family, there was no evidence of them and no contact after the Civil War. Was it possible this was Harriet's daughter? If she had been born in Maryland, she would have inherited Harriet's slave status. Also, Harriet was dark-skinned, whereas Margaret was light-skinned, perhaps suggesting one of her parents was white. Could Harriet have been the victim of assault from a white owner? It would add more weight to the reason behind Harriet deciding suddenly to leave the South when she did, not merely the reasons of being sold. It could even go some way to explaining the loss of John Tubman's affections, as not all men were understanding of this situation at that time. Perhaps Harriet hid the child with a free black family she knew well, planning either that the child was now safe or to return for her when she was settled in the North. All of this is conjecture, but some modern historians now believe this makes the most sense for the strange taking of Margaret. It was perhaps a reconciliation rather than a kidnapping. In 1858, she was introduced to John Brown, a vehement abolitionist who, unlike many at this time, advocated the use of violent rebellion to end slavery. Much like Harriet herself, he also had a strong belief in his faith, and he spoke of being called to end slavery by God. Although Harriet never advocated violent methods, she did agree with his desire for direct action, and she was supportive of his aims. The two both despised abolitionists who were not prepared to take direct action against slavery, and both had come to view slavery not merely as a sin, but as a form of war. He shared with her his plans for an uprising that might be the catalyst for a full-scale war of slaves and abolitionists against the South, and was deeply encouraged by her suggestions and approval, considering he had so far been met with tepid interest by other abolitionists. In his efforts to gather up supporters who would actively help him with this plan, Harriet was recruited, known to Brown as General Tubman. Harriet herself gathered up several formerly enslaved men to be part of his raid. Although both were committed to the plan, it was stalled in 1858, and Harriet promised to use her considerable influence to raise funds for the raid. Over the course of 1859, she travelled, giving talks and encouraging her audience to open their wallets. John Brown and his son settled near Harper's Ferry, with the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry as his target. He was warned by Frederick Douglass, who Brown had tried to recruit to no avail, that it would be a perfect steel trap. But this did not put Brown off, and he prepared to launch his attack with the handful of followers he had in late 1859. Unfortunately, Harriet could not be contacted. It's thought either she was still trying to recruit former slaves in Ontario, or that she was in New York with a fever related to her recurring illness from her head injury. The raid failed. Disregarding his inability to raise followers of his own prior to the attack, it seemed not to occur to Brown that he would be unable to convince hundreds of slaves in the surrounding areas to rise up. He was unable, and Frederick Douglass's warning had been correct. After just 48 hours, the small band of soldiers were reduced to just Brown and 3 others, as well as hostages. Attempts to negotiate were met with gunfire, and John Brown was wounded in the attack, bleeding and led off to jail. His trial was swift, and he was found guilty of treason and murder and was hanged on the 2nd of December. For the abolitionists, his death was seen as martyrdom for the cause and recreated him as a heroic figure. For Harriet, the loss was deeply more personal. She had known him as a close friend who shared her views, and it must have been a terrible loss in her life. But his death also reinforced her hatred of slavery and her determination that she would contribute to its abolition in her lifetime. In 1861, the tensions between North and South had reached a crisis point. In response to the continued swell of abolitionists and those fighting against slavery, the slaveholders fought against this with increased fines and vitriol, finally proclaiming several southern states independent as the Confederate States of America. War could no longer be avoided. But despite his later moniker of the Great Emancipator, ending slavery was not Lincoln's original aim. Restoring the Union was. Harriet, alongside many of her fellow African Americans, joined the effort where they could. She trailed along with troops from Massachusetts, eventually ending up at Fort Monroe, where she aided refugees as a cook and nurse and everything in between. Then, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which announced that all 3.5 million enslaved people in the southern states were now legally free, and if they could make their way to the Union line, they would be free permanently. Those who made it across were encouraged to join the Army of the United States. This was a huge step towards freedom for all black Americans, and Harriet decided now was the time for her to take the step from citizen volunteer to soldier. Port Royal had been captured by Union forces just over a year before, and Harriet arrived in 1862, shortly after being drafted to work as a nurse. In 1863, her work changed, and her knowledge of travelling under subterfuge and through difficult terrain such as marshes and rivers was acknowledged as being useful to the cause. She led a group under the orders of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, through the land around Port Royal to map out the terrain and scout the inhabitants. While Stanton at first had not wanted to use black soldiers, he did want to get a hold over the Confederacy, and he was happy to allow black soldiers to risk their lives as spies. Not only this, but Harriet herself was listed as commander of her men, the first black woman to be in that position. She also gained advance intelligence, which she passed on to Stanton, who in turn passed this on to Colonel James Montgomery, who was planning an assault on Jacksonville, Florida. The success of this raid gave confidence to the Union side that guerrilla operations would work, and this in turn increased the responsibility Harriet was given. Later that year, Harriet would become the first woman to lead an armed assault during the Civil War. But more than that, she would lose her anonymity, and for the first time, she would become known by her name. On the night of June the 2nd, 3 federal ships set out along the Combahee River. But the fates of the soldiers on board rested not only with their commander, Colonel James Montgomery, but with Moses, the fiercely brave and famous 5-foot Harriet, who led them through the mine-laden waters. She had gained intelligence on the locations of the mines hidden beneath the surface, and was able to help steer the vessels to safety. They stopped at various places along the shoreline, rescuing slaves and taking them on board as Union soldiers set fire to the plantations, seizing food and supplies. Harriet later described the scene. "I never saw such a sight. Sometimes the women would come with twins hanging around their necks. It appears I never saw so many twins in my life. Bags on their shoulders, baskets on their heads, and the young ones tagging along behind, all loaded. Pigs squealing, chickens screaming, young ones squealing." By the time the Confederate officer and soldiers, a few miles away at Green Pond, raced to the scene, the steamboats packed with liberated people had already long since left for the city of Beaufort. More than 750 people were saved by 150 black Union soldiers. The estates of the slave-holding families who had exploited human lives for financial gain for so long were left destroyed, burning in the fury of a liberated people. Harriet continued to help with missions, but her skills as a nurse were needed when Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, leading a regiment of elite black soldiers, planned with General George Strong to lead an assault on Fort Wagner. Sadly, despite the brave and valiant efforts of the Union soldiers, the attack was a failure. Of the 5,000 Union men involved in the assault, over 1,500 died, while the rest managed to retreat. The black soldiers who were wounded were sent to Harriet at Port Royal. While she was horrified at the carnage, she was immensely proud of the soldiers who earned themselves glory that day. Shaw was one of those who died, and his body was withheld by Confederate officers, who buried him with the fallen black soldiers, seeing this as an insult. But to rebuttal this, his family dissuaded attempts to recover his body, instead saying how proud they were that he was buried amongst his men who had fought so bravely. For the next 2 years, Harriet continued her duties as a nurse at Port Royal, and also led scouting missions into Southern Territory. But during this time, her illness also resurfaced, and her health suffered, leading to her needing to recuperate at times in New York. When the Confederacy finally surrendered in April 1865, Harriet remained on to help for a few more months before returning home to her family. It must have been with a mixture of relief and pride, but also anger at her treatment for her years of service. She had never been given a regular salary, back pay, or recognition, and many times she had to use her own money to fund expeditions. The bittersweet victory went further. In the post-war landscape of Reconstruction, black freed people in the South found themselves part of a fresh wave of violence in an era that saw the rise of racialism recast as nostalgia for the rebels who lost. Harriet herself became part of this when making her way home to New York on the train. The conductor refused to believe a black woman would be carrying a soldier's pass that entitled her to ride in her carriage, and told Harriet to move to the baggage car. When she politely refused, she was manhandled by the conductor and 3 other men, who dumped her unceremoniously in the baggage car until her destination. The injuries she suffered from this incident were with her for months. This, along with many of her fellow African American soldiers, was her homecoming. By this point, Harriet was in her early 40s, but the illness from her head injury, as well as her general health, made her appear much older than she really was. She retreated to Auburn to continue her humanitarian efforts from there, as well as looking after her family. Harriet was kept in a constant state of poverty by still using her own limited funds to help others from odd jobs, as she found it difficult to obtain the war pension she was entitled to due to her unofficial status during the war and how slow the US government was in recognizing the debt it owed her. As she settled back home, she turned her charitable activities to those in her community, black people struggling with disabilities, orphans and veterans, recognizing that official assistance from the government was still segregated and severely lacking. Her contributions continued to ensure that hundreds would not go without, her desire to help others still strong as she advanced in years. But there were still some happy parts to Harriet's story. She would often take in boarders to help with paying the bills, and one of those boarders was a farmer named Nelson Charles Davis. He was working in Auburn as a bricklayer, and despite Harriet being 22 years his senior, the pair soon became very close friends. By all accounts, the difference in their age was of no consequence to them. They fell in love and married on March the 18th, 1869, at the Central Presbyterian Church. It must have been a satisfying difference to her first unrecorded marriage as a slave, compared to her second as a free woman in a recorded ceremony. In 1874, they also adopted a baby girl, whom they named Gertie. It is comforting to know that after the service Harriet gave to her country and the cause of abolishing slavery, she was finally able to have the family she had always yearned for. Sadly, in September 1873, still in financial woes, Harriet fell prey to a scam. Two men approached her brother John Henry Stewart with a proposition. They said $5,000 worth of gold was in their possession, part of a cache they had smuggled out of the South. They offered to sell it to him for $2,000 worth of banknotes. Although Harriet had been a shrewd woman most of her life, her poverty must have made her desperate, and she agreed to the exchange, eventually convincing her friend, the politician Anthony Schmidt, to give her the money with an expected return of the same amount in gold coin. She set off at night with Schmidt, her husband and brother to meet the men. They somehow got Harriet separated from the others, knocked her out, and left her gagged and bound while they made off with her purse. Her family found her in the morning, but the men and the money were long gone. The New York headlines were full of horror at this episode, especially with the news that their beloved Harriet Tubman had been left to die. Outraged, donations were raised for her, and representatives tried to pass a bill in Congress for Harriet to be back paid for her services during the war. Passed away on October the 14th, 1888 of tuberculosis, and Harriet was able to obtain a war widow's pension. After many years of rejected bills in Congress, in February 1899, they finally passed a bill which approved an amount of $20 a month, which was far less than a full soldier's pension. This was based on $8 from her widow's pension, plus $12 for her services as a nurse. However, she was still not publicly acknowledged as a scout and spy during the Civil War. Harriet also went on in her later life to promote the cause of women's suffrage. When once asked by a white woman if she believed women should be allowed the vote, Harriet replied crisply, "I suffered enough to believe it." She began to attend suffragist meetings and became friends with Susan B. Anthony and Emily Howland, two prominent American suffragists. She travelled around the country, speaking to large audiences and talking of her actions during the Civil War, drawing on examples in modern history of women's bravery to show they were equal to men. When the National Federation of Afro-American Women was founded in 1896, Tubman was the keynote speaker at its first meeting. As she advanced into old age, Harriet began to think about how her legacy would outlive her. She donated a parcel of her land to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, with the explicit instruction that the land would be used to create a home for elderly black people, the only one of its kind outside New York City. It took 5 years for it to be built, and Tubman was disappointed to find the church decided to charge residents either $3 a week or $150 for lifetime privileges. She said, They make a rule that nobody should come in without they have $100. Now I wanted to make a rule that nobody should come in unless they didn't have no money at all. Nevertheless, on June the 23rd, 1908, Harriet was still the guest of honour at its grand opening. The day-long celebrations included a parade, speeches, a concert, a dinner and dancing. The enormous scope of these celebrations must have been at least in part to honour the city's famous resident. By 1911, she had become so frail that she was herself admitted into the care home that bore her name. By 1913, she succumbed to pneumonia and fell very ill in her bed. Her friends and family gathered by her bedside, and her coming death was reported on by local papers, all praising her work for the abolition of slavery and in the Civil War. She had seen many of her comrades pass away before her, nieces, nephews and siblings, as well as both of her husbands. Harriet had dedicated her life in service of her great cause, of the freedom of her people, and had never stopped fighting for those in need, even in her retirement. On the evening of March the 10th, 1913, she closed her eyes and died. Before she passed, her last words to the mourners around her were, "I go to prepare a place for you." She was buried with military honours in Fort Hill Cemetery near her husband, Nelson Davies. After she died, she became an American icon, revered in stories retold many times over, praised by leaders across the political spectrum, and inspired generations of African Americans who continued to fight for their rights and freedoms. Harriet Tubman could not possibly have realised the impact her life's journey would make when she escaped slavery back in 1849, but her bravery, intelligence and unshakable faith have created a lasting legacy that continues well into the present day and continues to inspire countless people.